What we're going to tell you now is not written, it's real fact, scary stories. So sit down and come with me.
I've dug over 3,000 graves in 42 years of service. I've seen burials in the rain, in the sun, with many people crying, and with no one. I've buried a coffin that arrived wrong, a flower that fell into the grave, and even a relative who fainted and almost went with it. But only one grave, only one of them, cried back. This is the kind of thing we don't even tell our children or our priests. I even considered keeping this secret with me. But lately, it's like that voice is still here inside, trapped deep inside, brushing against the soul's ear. You know, there are things that the more we keep quiet, the louder they scream. And if I don't tell them now, maybe they'll never stop. It all happened in a small cemetery in rural Georgia. One of those with no system, no surveillance, no cameras, just mud, wooden crosses, and names erased by the rain. A place where the earth seems to know too much and speak too little. By then, I was close to retirement. I worked alone, keeping the place clean, trimming the tall grass, repainting the headstones with fading letters. It was a silent job, tranquil, the kind of silence that brings peace. But that week, the silence changed. It became heavy, as if someone were watching behind every crooked cross, as if something was waiting. The man who was buried was named Alfredo Costa, 68 years old, a war veteran. He lived alone in a house at the edge of the camp. He died in his sleep, according to the death certificate. The body arrived early. The family was small, only a handful of relatives. A thin widow, 2 daughters, and a grandson in a blue suit with fearful eyes. The coffin was sealed. A simple burial, like so many others I've had. The wooden cross was hand-inscribed with the name. Nothing unusual, nothing to draw attention to. Until that moment, it was just another stuffy afternoon, a common burial in a forgotten corner of the world. But there are some things that can be deceiving. Sometimes silence isn't peace. Sometimes it's just a different kind of scream, a scream that's still getting ready to come out. And that afternoon, I had no idea that the ground would still try to speak to me. If you've made it this far, it's because you also feel there's something waiting to be heard. Stay with me until the end. And if the story gives you goosebumps like it gave me when I lived it, you'll know what to do. That same afternoon, after everyone had left, I stayed to completely close the grave. It was part of my routine, waiting for the wake to empty, checking to make sure nothing had been forgotten, a necklace left on the grave or a candle still lit. The weather was cloudy, and the wind blew dryly, making the leaves dance as if they were trying to escape. I finished compacting the earth, adjusted the cross, wiped the sweat from my brow, and sat on the edge of the old bench that stood between the tombs in the west wing. It was a good place to breathe a little, to think about the life I still had left, and about the dead who no longer had time to think about anything. The sun was beginning to set, tinting the sky a strange, almost sickly red when I heard the first sound. At first, I thought it was in my head, a muffled, deep sound, quite unlike anything I'd ever heard there. It wasn't wind, nor animals, nor wood creaking. It was a voice, but not a clear, articulate voice. It was as if someone had a mouthful of dirt and was still trying to scream. A strangled, desperate wail, as if the air were being forcibly wrenched from their chest. I stood up slowly, my heart giving me the warning signs that something was wrong. I tried to pinpoint the source of the sound, but the echo seemed to circle the entire cemetery. I took my first steps between the headstones, my breath held, as if even the air was afraid to move. And then I stopped, right in front of the newly closed grave. The sound was coming from there, from below. There was no doubt about it. It was a scream, muffled, scratchy, insistent, as if someone or something was still alive down there trying to get out. My body froze. My hands were sweating, even with the cold wind biting my arms. I looked around, hoping to see someone, anything that would justify this, but there were only crosses, shadows, and the echo of the impossible. I grabbed the shovel leaning against the shed wall and ran to the grave. I began digging quickly, the still damp earth making everything difficult. Each blow felt like a blow to my own fear. I sweated, breathed heavily, felt my hands burn and my arms grow heavy, but I kept digging as if someone's life depended on it, because deep down, I knew it did. But with each shovel I tossed aside, the scream faded. Not abruptly. It grew fainter, as if the screamer were losing strength. The sound grew more distant, hoarser, slower, until there was nothing left but the sound of my own labored breathing. Silence returned, but now it was a different kind of silence. A dry, cold, embarrassed silence, as if I'd let myself see something I shouldn't have. I stopped digging when I was knee-deep in dirt and my heart was pounding. There was no more sound. There was nothing. But I felt there was still something there. Something that couldn't be seen or dug up. Something that didn't want to be forgotten. I returned home that night with shovel in hand, boots covered in mud, and a sinking feeling in my chest. I tried to convince myself it had been an illusion, exhaustion, some kind of hallucination caused by sleep or stress. But as I lay in bed, in the darkness of my room, I swore I heard it again, faintly, distant, but recognizable. But what scares me the most is that voice seemed to know my name. The next morning, I arrived at the cemetery early as usual, but I couldn't face the previous day's grave without feeling a knot in my stomach. The cross stood there firm, but there was something strange in the air. An uncomfortable silence, an emptiness that seemed to observe rather than rest. I spent the whole day feigning normalcy, sweeping leaves, arranging other headstones, but my attention kept returning to that exact spot, as if something there was still unresolved. And it wasn't. Shortly after 4 in the afternoon, the administration phone rang. On the other end, the distressed voice of a funeral home employee asked to speak to me directly. I thought it was odd, as I rarely receive calls like that. He spoke quickly, confused, trying to maintain a professional tone, but it was clear he was panicking. According to him, during the previous day's documentation check, an inconsistency had been noted in the identification of 2 bodies released that same morning. The name Alfredo Costa was linked to a body that never left the morgue. At first, I thought it was some administrative error, something simple to resolve. But when he mentioned the name of the other deceased involved in the alleged exchange, Andrew Cosner, an unknown outsider with no relatives, who died under as yet unexplained circumstances, my blood ran cold. I felt a pang in my chest, as if someone had hit me hard inside. They weren't sure yet, but there was strong evidence that the bodies had been switched before the official burial. I hung up without being able to say much. The phone was still in my hand when Alfredo's widow appeared at the cemetery, accompanied by her 2 daughters and her grandson, the same boy in the blue suit who hadn't taken his eyes off the grave the day before. She was nervous, crying, but there was something different in her face now, a distrust, a pain that seemed to have changed shape overnight. She said that, even at the wake, the face inside the coffin had struck her as strange. It seemed different. But everyone convinced her it was grief, the impact, the fatigue, that it was common for the dead to change their appearance, that it was best not to open the coffin. The gravedigger who buries doesn't ask, doesn't argue, he buries. But there, before her, hearing those words, I began to doubt everything I'd done in the last 24 hours. And I realized that the impossible I'd heard might just be the audible part of a much deeper and real error. The next day, The family demanded immediate exhumation, and despite the slow bureaucracy and city hall procedures, they obtained authorization to reopen the tomb in less than 48 hours. I personally witnessed the process. The shovel in my hands trembled, not from exertion, but from guilt. Each shovelful of earth I removed felt heavier than the last, as if the earth resisted the idea of revealing what was hidden. When the coffin was raised, the lid was removed right there, with relatives around and a coroner from the funeral home present. And what we saw wasn't Alfredo. The body lay in a desperate position, its arms bent upward, as if someone had tried to break the lid from within. The fingers were bloodied, their nails partially torn off, the skin on. Its face was scratched, and the eyes, even now dead, seemed to still beg for help. No one said anything for a few seconds that felt like hours. Silence fell over the cemetery again, but this time it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was one of horror. The coroner performed a preliminary analysis while still there. He said that apparently the cause of death had not been recorded correctly, that there were clear signs of asphyxiation due to mechanical suffocation, that perhaps he was still alive. When he was buried, the widow broke down. Her daughters wept loudly. The grandson, that boy, he didn't cry. He just stood there staring at the coffin with the same expression as the day before. But this time, without blinking, without moving a muscle. I left carrying more than just an iron shovel and dirty hands. I carried with me the weight of having buried a man alive. And the only thing that had been hammering away at my head ever since was what exactly he was trying to say. Because the scream wasn't just one of despair. There was something more there, something that seemed to be trying to warn. And I still had no idea that what was buried hadn't finished talking to me yet. 2 weeks after the exhumation, the official report was ready. I wasn't in the room when the family received the document, but I learned the details from someone at the funeral home who respected me. The document held no great surprise for anyone who had already seen Andrew Cosner's body inside that. Coffin, cause of death, confinement hypoxia. In other words, he was buried, alive. And the part that haunts me most to this day is that this wasn't a common mistake. It wasn't just a body swap. It was an entire rotten system, operating as if the rush to end a life were more important than the care taken to confirm that it was truly over. The marks inside the coffin lid were clear. Fingernails dragged in sequence, as if the victim had tried to scratch the wood not once or twice, but hundreds, perhaps thousands, as oxygen slowly faded and consciousness faded in a cycle of prolonged agony, the kind of death that shouldn't even exist in hell, the kind of end no soul should know. Most cruel of all was the position of the body. On its side, legs bent, as if it had tried to turn, reposition itself, free itself, but inside there was no room for escape, only despair. The interior walls were damp, indicating he was still sweating when he was placed there. His mouth, half open, his lips, bitten until they bled, seemed frozen in a cry for help that was never heard. Looking back, the whole scene seems like something out of an old nightmare, the kind where you wake up drenched but can't remember the details. Except I remember. Every damn detail. And even with everything proven, everything confirmed, no one was arrested. The funeral home claimed human error, the family remained silent amid their grief, and the city, well, the city always knew how to forget what bothers it. And what about me? I returned to the cemetery. I returned to sweeping dry leaves, repainting faded letters, arranging artificial flowers on forgotten graves. But something in me had been buried along with that body, and unlike Andrew, I felt I was still alive. But inside, I was starting to gasp for air. The nights began to change. The early morning silence was no longer the same. It seemed to carry layers. sounds that only revealed themselves if you stayed still enough. I began to hear things. First there were muffled footsteps among the graves, then creaks of wood, but all the gates were locked. On the third night, I heard what sounded like breathing coming from beneath the earth. Not a groan, not a wail, just a deep, insistent breathing that rose and fell around a single grave. That one. I started dreaming about him. In the dream, I was burying the same body over and over. Each time I threw dirt over it, the wood shifted, and I woke up sweating, with my fists clenched and my nails digging into my palms. One night, I woke up with my nails so deep in my flesh that I had to wash the blood off in the kitchen sink, and what scared me most was realizing that the dirt under my nails wasn't mine. It was dirt. Alfredo's family, the real Alfredo, held a new burial, this time with an open casket. And even though it was a grave mistake, a mistake that could have been avoided, they maintained a look of resignation. No overt anger, no desire for revenge. It was as if deep down they had accepted that certain things just happen. I, on the other hand, couldn't accept it. I couldn't forget. I returned to the grave late in the afternoon, alone, days after the second burial. I sat there for hours, sitting on the grass, staring at the cross. I said a few words, apologized, cried a little, which is rare for me. And when I got up to leave, I felt something tug at the hem of my pants. I looked back with my heart in my throat, but there was nothing. Nothing but the elongated shadow of the cross and an ant-hole dug right next to the grave, making a faint sound, as if air escaped from it from time to time. I left in a hurry, but before I walked through the gate, I turned around for one last look, and at that moment, I swear by all that is holy, I heard knocks. 3, sharp, precise, as if someone were once again knocking on the coffin. And the strangest thing is that it didn't sound like a cry for help. It sounded like a warning. After that night, everything changed. In the cemetery, tools began disappearing from the storage room. Small things at first, a shovel, a pair of gloves, the kerosene from the lantern. Then came the electrical outages in the poles, even without storms, and the motion sensors, which were rarely activated, began blinking randomly, always pointing to the same spot, the grave where the mistake was made, the grave with the wrong cross. I tried to rationalize, to attribute the events to chance, but what I saw didn't seem like a coincidence. The flowers placed there by family members withered within hours. A white rose even darkened before my eyes. And during a routine pruning job, I noticed that the vegetation around the grave seemed to flee. The grass no longer grew there. It was as if even nature had decided to keep its distance. I also began to notice that birds avoided that area of the field. They circled, avoiding the area as if some invisible barrier kept them away. One afternoon, I saw a stray cat approach the cross. It stopped 2 steps away, arched its back, raised its hackles, and fled with a meow that sounded more like a warning cry. Nothing in that place remained peaceful, neither alive nor dead. But what really kept me awake at night was the cross, that damned wooden cross. The administration had told me to replace it with a new, sturdier, more standardized one, following the cemetery's new visual norm. I accepted the task as a way to try to put an end to it. I buried a new stake, inscribed the deceased's name, adjusted the plaque, and left, thinking I'd done my part. The next morning I found the cross fallen, not toppled by the wind, but ripped out, its base broken at an odd angle, as if it had been pulled from the earth. I replaced it. 3 days later, the same result. I had the base cemented, same thing, until I gave up. I left the old cross back, cracked, blackened, its inscription smudged by the rain. And, strangely, after that, everything calmed down. From the outside, it Seemed the cemetery had returned to its normal routine, but inside something remained wrong. I felt an unfinished cycle, as if the error committed had not only been human, but spiritual. Something had been broken, a respite denied. And every time I passed that point, my body reacted with chills, my mouth went dry, and my heart pounded at an unusual rate. In an attempt to find peace, I began writing letters, small confessions, fragments of what I remembered, what I dreamed, what I feared. I rolled up the papers and left them under rocks in the field, as if I were trying to return something to the earth. But one day, I found one of those letters torn up and covered in dirt, as if they'd dug it back up. That night, I woke to the sound of the storage room door slamming shut. I jumped up, grabbed my flashlight and went over. When I opened it, there was nothing, no sign of forced entry, no animal. But on the floor, right in the center of the room, was the ancient cross, the one I had planted on the grave, and which somehow was now inside, covered in dirt, wet, and with a detail that took my breath away. The name on the cross was no longer the same. And the most disturbing thing is that now mine was written. Since that early morning, I've never slept with my bedroom door closed again. It may seem silly, a silly superstition of tired old people, but when you feel the air in your own room begin to grow heavy, that darkness is no longer just the absence of light, but the presence of something watching you. You learn to respect certain voids, and the worst of these voids is the one no one else can see. I kept the cross that had appeared in the storage room under my bed, wrapped in an old cloth, along with other objects I'd accumulated over the years, things no one wanted, memories that remained. But something about that wood bothered me. It was as if, even hidden, it remained standing. It had a presence. Some nights I would wake for no reason, and for a moment I thought I was back in the cemetery, standing before the grave, shovel in hand, the muffled sound emerging from beneath the earth. It was no longer a nightmare. It was a memory that refused to become the past. I tried to quit my job. I went to the administration office, handed in my resignation, and explained that my body couldn't handle the strain anymore. I made up stories about knee pain and back fatigue, saying I wanted to enjoy my remaining years away from death. The coordinator understood, signed the papers, and wished me peace. But the next day, I went to the cemetery anyway. It was as if the earth had called me, as if it still had something to tell me. I sat on the bench in the west wing, the same as always. I surveyed the neatly lined headstones, the ancient graves, the clean field I'd maintained for over 40 years. And then I saw it, a new cross. I noticed it hadn't been there the day before. It had been placed there during the early hours of the morning. No one had informed me of a new burial, and yet there it was. No flowers, no name, no date. Just a simple cross, embedded deep in the earth, and beneath it, the same spot where it all began. I stood up slowly, approaching unhurriedly, as if each step required approval from something invisible. As I approached, I saw a folded sheet of paper at the foot of the cross. It was a letter. I recognized the paper, the fold, the handwriting. It was one of the ones I had buried, and someone, or something, had brought it back. I knelt to read, my hands shaking, my throat dry. The words were smeared with mud, but still legible. And they weren't mine. What was written there wasn't a cry for help, nor a warning. It was an answer. And in that last line, written in thin, crooked letters, as if traced with the tip of a fingernail, there was only one sentence. Now you know what it's like to be trapped underground. But the difference is that you can still hear. At that moment, the wind stopped. Silence returned, and for the first time I felt no fear. I felt that it all wasn't over yet. Working in a cemetery teaches us to listen to silences. I'm not talking about that ordinary silence, made of the absence of sound, but of another kind. A silence that seems to carry the weight of everything unsaid, of all the interrupted goodbyes, of the secrets that die along with those who can no longer speak. It was in this kind of silence that I buried Evelyn Burke, a small woman with wrinkled hands and sunken eyes. She lived alone in an old apartment on the east side of the city. She didn't have many relatives, just a daughter who showed up at the wake looking more relieved than sad, and two elderly neighbors who remained silent the entire time, as if grief were something too intimate to share. It was a chilly autumn afternoon. Leaves covered some of the graves, and the sky seemed suspended, as if something above was holding its breath. I remember it well because I don't usually notice the weather, but that day there was a strange smell. It wasn't rot, nor was it flowers. It was like when you enter a room where someone has cried for hours, that smell of an open soul, of old anguish that lingered in the air. The ceremony lasted less than 20 minutes. No speech, no music, just a quick reading of a Bible verse by a pastor who seemed to have another engagement immediately afterward. They didn't even place a cross. They said it would be taken care of later. I did my work in silence, as always. Shovel after shovel, I returned Evelyn to the earth, and with each layer, I felt a different weight, not in my body, but in my consciousness. Something told me I was covering more than a coffin, that somehow I was suffocating something that still wanted to speak. I finished the burial, cleaned the tools, signed the register, and left with the feeling I'd forgotten something. I didn't go back to check. After all, who returns to a newly sealed grave just because they had a hunch? The truth is, we learn to ignore certain intuitions when we deal with death every day. But that night, as I closed my eyes to sleep, I heard a sound. I don't know if it was in the world or inside my head. A low, hoarse, muffled sound, like someone slowly tapping on the inside of a box. And that's where it all began. That night, when the muffled sound echoed through my mind, I tried to convince myself it was just a remnant of exhaustion. It wouldn't be the first time fatigue had played tricks on me. But there was something different about that sound. It wasn't a start, like a snap or a sudden scream. It was a call, constant, contained, almost pleading. I had trouble sleeping, and when day broke, the weight on my chest hadn't disappeared. On the contrary, it had grown like an echo that refused to die. During breakfast, I left the TV on without paying attention. My gaze was fixed on the cup, trembling slightly in my hand. Not from the cold, but from something I couldn't yet name. That same afternoon, I was assigned to a quick maintenance job in one of the cemetery's oldest sections. It was the same section where Mrs. Evelyn had been buried 2 days earlier. As I was clearing dry leaves from around the graves, something made me stop. The sound returned, but this time, clearer. It wasn't metallic. It was human. A scream. High-pitched, trembling, it came from beneath the earth. I froze. It couldn't be. I approached with slow steps and knelt beside the grave. I pressed my ear to the ground. Silence. Then again, the scream. Faint, as if my lungs were draining their last breath. My first impulse was to run, but my second reaction was even stronger, to seek help. I entered the small warehouse where the administration was located and found Mr. Wilkins, my supervisor. He was a middle-aged man, rigid, practical, and known for not listening to emotional nonsense. I explained what I had heard, asked for permission to reopen the grave immediately, and even tried to argue that there was something wrong with the burial. He stared at me with the cold gaze of someone who has buried their own compassion. "Noise from underground plumbing," he said. "There are old pipes that echo like voices, especially when the ground is damp." I tried to insist. He held up his hand, dismissing the matter. If you dig even an inch without the family's permission, you're fired. I left trembling, but not with fear. It was anger. It was helplessness. I returned to the tomb, and even without touching anything, I remained there for a few minutes on my knees, as if keeping a vigil. But the sound didn't return, nor the screams, only that silence, the same as on the day of the burial, only now, even heavier, more definitive. That night, I drank a shot of cheap whiskey and went to bed early. But sleep wouldn't come, and the silence wouldn't stay either. It was as if my mind was too busy trying to simulate what might be happening 6 feet below. Each time sleep threatened to overtake me, the same question would pull me back. What if she's alive? What if I'm letting someone die down there? What if the sound comes back tomorrow and no one hears it anymore? But the sound didn't come back. And that's exactly where my guilt began. 2 days after that awkward silence, I received a call that chilled me even before I answered. The display showed a restricted number, and when I answered, the voice on the other end belonged to Mrs. Evelyn's daughter. Cold, direct, demanding explanations. She wanted to know if I had noticed anything unusual at her mother's funeral, if everything had been done according to protocol. I was taken aback. I replied that I had followed every step precisely. She was silent for a few seconds and then told me she had received an anonymous handwritten letter saying she had overheard shouting from her mother's grave. The letter had no return address, but it contained details that only someone who was there could know. She ended the conversation with a sentence that left me cold. If this letter is true, it will be your fault. The next morning, an official exhumation order was issued at the family's request. The proceedings would be attended by a sheriff, a coroner, and of course me, the gravedigger who had been the last to see the woman before the earth swallowed her. The coffin was carefully brought to the surface. The tools clinked with a sound that, at that moment, seemed louder than usual. The coroner asked that no one speak until he opened the lid. We all watched in absolute silence as the security seal was broken and the nails removed one by one, as if each hammer blow were a belated apology. What we saw there, no one will ever forget. Evelyn's face was no longer that of a serene old woman. It was distorted by panic, pain, and shortness of breath. Her eyes, still open, betrayed the desperation of what she witnessed there, alone. But what struck her most wasn't her expression. It was the marks of on the inside of the coffin lid. Desperate, deep, crisscrossed lines, as if each attempt to scratch it were a silent plea for mercy. Small pieces of skin and dried blood clung to the wood. There was also a loose tooth, probably broken when she tried to bite through the lining. She tried everything to get out. The coroner wasted no time in confirming the obvious. Evelyn Burke was not dead when she was buried. He pointed out that the previous examination had been inconclusive, and likely due to her advanced age and the rigidity of her body, they had declared her dead without waiting long. Enough! The medical error sealed her fate. But what brought a lump to my throat wasn't the error. It was the fact that I had heard the screams. It was the fact that she could have been alive when I had thrown the last shovelful of dirt. And yet, I walked away. Even so, I shut out what I heard. I chose to obey orders rather than do what was right. His daughter didn't blame me out loud, but the look he gave me late that afternoon said it all. It was the kind of look that tears more than any scream. And there, before the reopened coffin, I realized it no longer mattered who had erred first. In the end, we all erred. Out of convenience, out of fear, out of bureaucracy. Evelyn screamed, and the world covered its ears. I was just one more. After that day, I took an indefinite leave of absence. I could no longer step foot in the cemetery without hearing the scratching sound of wood. The nights became long, and sleep a punishment. But it was when I tried to forget, when I tried to move on with my life and turn the page, that I received another unexpected visit. A manila envelope left unsigned under my door. Inside, a single sheet of paper. No sentence, no accusation. Just an exact copy of the letter Evelyn's daughter had received. But with one difference. In the bottom corner of the page, written in shaky handwriting, was a small scribble, a single sentence in red. She left something with you. The same night I received the envelope, something changed inside the house. I don't know if it was me who changed my outlook, or if it was the house that had absorbed the weight of what I'd experienced. Every piece of furniture seemed darker than before, every corner more cramped. The door, which had creaked in the wind, began to sound like a lament, and the wall clock, which had stopped for years, started ticking on its own again. I thought of madness, post-traumatic stress, but deep down, I already knew. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just psychological. That phrase, written at the bottom of the letter, "She left something with you," began to repeat like a silent echo in my mind, as if I were carrying something I couldn't see but felt. A weight that didn't come from my shoulders, but from my soul. I spent days trying to understand what Evelyn could have left me. I rummaged through my tool closet, looked inside my coat worn on the day of the funeral, rummaged through the canvas bag with personal belongings that were sometimes forgotten at the cemetery. Nothing. But the discomfort persisted. It was as if something were inside me, not with me, as if a presence was watching me from the inside out. It watched me through mirrors, reflections, the shadow that didn't match my movements. Until one night, while showering, I noticed something that gave me chills. 3 thin, parallel marks on the side of my ribs, like scratches, but deeper than a simple domestic accident. Dried blood around the edges, no memory of having been hurt. I began having recurring nightmares. In the dream, I was underground. The coffin lid was above me, my arms immobile, my screams stuck in my throat. But the scariest part wasn't being buried. It was not being alone. There was someone else there, a woman. Her long, wet hair covered her face. She didn't move, but her eyes were alive. They watched me, as if waiting for me to say something, as if demanding something. I always woke at the same moment, when she slowly opened her mouth and said my name. My full name, the same one written on my work uniform. It was as if she knew me, as if she were following me. One rainy afternoon, I decided to visit Evelyn's grave again. The area was empty, as if even death had taken a day off. I brought flowers. A ridiculous gesture, I know, but something inside me urged me to do so. As I approached the grave, I noticed someone had recently left something there. A small object wrapped in a white cloth, wet from the drizzle. When I bent down to get a better look, my heart raced. It was her brooch, the one she wore at the wake, an old medallion with a faded image of a woman weeping. It had disappeared the day of the burial. I'd even mentioned it to the funeral attendant, and now it was there, as if it had returned on its own. I reached for the blowjob, but as I touched it, I felt a chill run down my arm to the back of my neck. The cloth was cold, almost frozen, despite the mild temperature, and along with it, folded inside, was a piece of paper, an old, faded, handwritten sheet. The letters trembled as if written in haste or desperation, and the content was a poem, a lament, something like a distorted prayer, with passages speaking of eyes open in the dark, bones that listen, and the earth that breathes back. But one final line completely paralyzed me. If you still carry her name in your memory, then she hasn't been buried yet. I didn't understand. Or maybe you did, and you just didn't want to accept it. Because from that day on, I started noticing something much worse than dreams, or scratches, or guilt. I started feeling her breath inside mine. The morning after the encounter with the blowjob and the note, I tried to get back to my routine. I cooked. I washed the dishes. I watched television without paying attention, but everything around me seemed out of place. Things were in their place, but their location seemed wrong, as if my house had been moved a few millimeters to the side during the night. An invisible shift, imperceptible to the naked eye, but one that made me stumble over sensations. And that was when I decided to visit Evelyn's grave again, perhaps in search of some logic that could tie it all together. I returned to section 7, the oldest part of the cemetery. I arrived with tense shoulders but alert eyes. I walked slowly between the graves, feeling the air thicker than usual, as if the wind itself was pushing me back. When I spotted her headstone in the distance, something made me stop. The wooden cross that had been nailed in place was gone. In its place was another cross, smaller, cracked at the base, bearing the name of another deceased, George Callahan. The birth date was similar, but the name was wrong. The strangest thing was that the grave next door, which should have belonged to the Callahan, also bore no cross. I thought it was vandalism, or a mistake by the night crew, but something told me it wasn't. The change didn't seem recent. The surrounding earth was dry. The wood didn't appear to have been installed that day. I returned the next day to confirm, and to my astonishment, the cross had moved again. Now it was on the grave of a woman named Margaret Doyle. Evelyn once again was unmarked. I informed the new supervisor, since Wilkins had been removed after the exhumation incident. He laughed and said someone must be playing pranks. Young people like to play these pranks, he said. But that area of the cemetery was locked at night. No visitors, no access, and yet the cross moved, not by human hands, but as if she herself refused to remain on that body. That's when I decided to do something I'd never done before. I returned to the site at night without warning anyone. With a flashlight, a coat, and an old notebook where I wrote names and maintenance dates, I hid behind a row of graves and waited. The early morning chill was biting, but my eyes didn't blink. At 3:12 a.m., I heard footsteps, but they weren't steady, like those of an intruder or a thief. They were shuffling, light, like those of an elderly person walking barefoot on wet leaves. I pointed the flashlight. Nothing. No presence, no silhouette, just the crosses. And then I realized Evelyn's cross had disappeared again. In its place, the ground was disturbed, as if something underground had pushed it from within. I approached, my heart racing and my eyes bleary from the effort I was making to comprehend what I was seeing. Leaning against the side of the headstone, as if it had been placed there from within the grave, was the original cross, the same dark wood with her name carved with a knife. And on the back, something written, not with ink, but with dried blood. Bury me properly. That early morning, after seeing the cross stained with dried blood and that phrase engraved like a whisper drenched in guilt, I didn't go straight home. I wandered the empty city streets, trying to erase from my mind the image of that dark wood begging for rest. But no matter how much I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was clinging to me, something that wasn't physical, but that followed me wherever I went. As I pulled into the driveway, something about the gate made my bones freeze. The chain-link fence surrounding my yard was different. It wasn't the wind nor vandalism. It was something specific that hadn't been there when I left. A piece of white fabric hanging, fluttering gently. A thin, worn cloth. I recognized it. Instantly, it was part of a dress, the same type of fabric as Evelyn wore at the wake. I remembered it well, because I was the one who arranged her in the coffin. I placed her hands on her stomach, adjusted the collar of her dress, and tied her feet. That piece was from the hem. It even had a small lace detail. I approached, and upon touching it, the sensation was icy, as if night had gathered there. But there was no explanation for it being in my backyard. No footprints, no sign of forced entry, no logic, just that cloth waving as if welcoming me back. I took the fabric inside and on impulse placed it on the table. I stared at it for minutes, and then I realized the cloth was folded in a strange way. It formed a symbol, a sort of crooked cross, with the edges marked with something that looked like ash, burnt wood ash. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat with the cloth on my lap, feeling that my home was no longer mine, that my thoughts were no longer my own, that my life had been invaded, not by a spirit, not by a curse, but by something denser, something that chose me, that clung to me, as if I were now the final resting place of a woman who never rested. And when the clock struck 3 sharp, the doorbell rang. It wasn't the first time I'd stepped onto sacred ground covered in dry leaves and buried memories, but there was something different about the place. The former St. Adalbert convent, hidden among damp hills on the outskirts of Boston, exuded a kind of silence that didn't soothe. On the contrary, it seemed to whisper inside one's skin. I'd been called to help clean and renovate the cemetery in the back, which would be partially repurposed for new burials, as the land was too large to be. And forgotten, or so they said. It wasn't a typical job, but after 20 years digging graves in 4 different cemeteries, I'd learned that what haunts these places most isn't the dead, but what people hide around them. The vegetation was overgrown, the graves were covered in slime, and the names on the headstones had already been erased by time, or by some kind of deliberate decision. One of the priests who greeted us was clear. Some records were lost in the fire of 1947, if you find anything. Strange, just let me know. That phrase stuck in my head all day. At 3 in the afternoon, the first burial was scheduled. A woman named Loretta Chambers, 89, a former Benedictine nun, would be the first to occupy one of the reused graves. As I dug, the shovel scraped against something that wasn't stone or root. It was wood, rotten and wet. I considered stopping, but the convent superior said it was common for remains of old coffins to be found, and that I should continue. I obeyed. Part of me was uncomfortable, but it wasn't as if I'd never seen remains before. Only this time, the smell was different, not of flesh. It was like an old perfume, too sweet to be natural, as if something had been poured there on purpose, something meant to linger. I finished digging the hole 6 feet deep. Everything seemed normal until the ceremony. The family was small. The priest read beautiful words. And at the end, a Latin chant echoed through the convent corridors. I was standing back, but I swear I felt the ground vibrate slightly beneath my feet. I didn't say anything. I thought it was exhaustion or paranoia. The body was buried, a wooden cross in place, and at nightfall the cemetery was locked as usual. I returned to my inn around 9 and ate dinner alone, reflecting on the day. But something bothered me more than usual, a kind of tension in my shoulders that wouldn't go away. As I lay down, I dozed off for a short time, and woke up without understanding why. The clock read 3:07. The street was completely silent, but outside the window, something echoed in the distance, almost imperceptible. It was a muffled sound. It wasn't a scream nor a cry. It was a kind of melody, the repetition of a phrase. I went to the window and opened it carefully. Nothing, just the light dawn breeze swaying the tree branches. But the sound persisted, subtle, rhythmic, almost like a whispered prayer. Only, I didn't understand a single word. It was a language my mind recognized as ancient. But my body reacted as if I'd heard it before. somewhere my memory refuses to access. That night, I knew the land didn't want to be disturbed, but it was too late. The first shovel had already cut through what should have been left untouched, and what lay beneath it still moved. The next day, I tried to go about my daily routine as if nothing had happened, but there was something in my body that wouldn't shut off. You know when you hear a sound long after it's stopped, as if it's gotten stuck in your ear and stuck there? That was it. The melody, or whatever it was, still vibrated inside me. I woke up tired, as if I hadn't slept. The hours in the cemetery seemed heavier. The tools felt colder. The earth wetter, as if the rain had fallen only there. That morning, while digging another grave in the same area, I decided to put my ear to the ground for a moment. It was just curiosity, nothing more. But what I heard left me cold. A muffled, very faint sound, as if someone were trying to speak from within the earth. I turned away, swallowed hard. I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, so I didn't tell anyone. But that night, again at 3 a.m., the sound returned. Only this time it was clearer, still distant, still as if it were behind a thick wall. But now there was something else, a cadence, like a prayer. I decided to record. I grabbed my phone, opened the recorder, and left it on the window. For about 3 minutes, the sound was captured. When I listened to the recording on my headphones, I felt the skin on the back of my neck crawl. It wasn't just one voice, there were several, overlapping, as if more than one person was speaking at once, but with the same intonation. The tone was feminine, but husky, as if the throat were raw, not screams, not moans, just words. Words spoken forcefully, as if they had been memorized in a ritual. And even without understanding a single sentence, I knew this wasn't a modern language. The next morning, I showed the recording to the convent's caretaker, a simple man who had been cleaning the hallways since the 1980s. He listened for a few seconds, frowned, and said, "It's not English, nor Spanish. That's old-school church stuff." I asked him to show it to someone who understood, and he called an older gardener named Victor, a devout Catholic. The old man listened for a minute and then put down the receiver, his hands shaking. He said he recognized the language. It was Latin. I stood still. It was as if a curtain had been torn away. Victor closed his eyes and began to repeat in a low voice, "Deliver me, Lord, from eternal death." He said those words were part of a prayer recited in ancient exorcism rituals, a plea from trapped souls. But there was something strange about the recording. The phrases seemed to be recited backward, as if someone had learned the prayer backward, or as if the intention was to unsay one's own liberation. I was overcome by physical discomfort, headache, nausea, cold, sweat. Victor looked at me and said this wasn't normal. There are things the church buries, but doesn't solve. Those were his words. The caretaker, upon hearing this, walked away, said he didn't want to get involved anymore, and asked me to delete the audio. But I couldn't. Something inside me wanted to understand. I wanted to know what those voices were saying, and why they were coming from that particular grave. I returned to the site late in the afternoon. The grave where we had buried Mrs. Loretta looked the same. The wooden cross was in place. The ground was packed and level. But as I approached, I noticed that the grass around it was slightly greener than the rest of the ground, as if something down there still breathed, as if the earth had been freshly fertilized with something that refuses to die. On the third night, I made another recording. I left my phone by the window for an hour, and then, with headphones on, I calmly reviewed the audio. That's when I noticed something that made me shudder. The voice was saying my name. First, almost drawlingly, like a distant whisper, then more forcefully. "Michael." 3 times. The last time, with a mournful intonation. Or was it a call? It paralyzed me. Because no one there knew my full name except the administrators, and even then I had never used my name during the funerals. Just the Gravedigger, as everyone called me. And it was exactly that morning that things changed, because I didn't just hear, he felt. The next morning, still disturbed by the recording, I went to the convent's small makeshift office and asked to speak with the priest in charge. His name was Clemente. He was a sober-looking man, always dressed in a traditional cassock, with deep-set eyes and hands that trembled slightly, as if he already carried more of the sins of others than his own. When I mentioned the recording, he interrupted me with a polite gesture, asking me to tone it down. I waited for him to close the door, and then I played the audio on my phone. He listened in silence, his eyes fixed on a random spot on the wall, as if he already knew what was coming. And when the voice murmured my name at the end, he turned off the device with the palm of his hand and said, almost in a whisper, "You shouldn't have gone back there." What he told me next wasn't in any record book, nor in the diocesan minutes. But his tone was that of someone who had kept this secret for too long. According to Clemente, the convent of St. Adalbert had been, for decades, an unofficial cloistered center for nuns considered spiritually dangerous. Women who, according to the Vatican, crossed the line between faith and heresy. Many of these sisters were not judged by ordinary justice, but rather silenced by the Church's own dogma. One in particular, whose name he almost refused to pronounce, was buried there, alive. Sister Agnes, young, brilliant, but too bold for her time. They claimed she had visions that contradicted doctrine, heard voices no one else heard, and spoke of an entity that used God's words backward. She began writing texts in Latin that no one could fully decipher, but which resembled prayers, inverted, as if it were a way to free not the living, but the dead who had been forgotten, or worse, buried without absolution. They accused her of heresy, of making pacts with ancient powers, and in 1936 she was condemned to eternal silence. There was no mass, no bells, just a cell sealed with cement, and what was left was buried there, exactly where we place Loretta Chambers today. The revelation hit me like a punch in the gut. Every detail made sense now, the inverted Latin, the overlapping voices, the lament. That land didn't want to be touched because it didn't just hold human remains, it held a buried secret. And now someone had unwittingly lifted the lid of oblivion. I asked if there was anything that could be done to silence those voices, and the priest hesitated. He said there was a kind of ritual, ancient, predating even the liturgical reform, but it required someone to come into direct contact with the tormented soul to truly offer redemption. Redemption. That was the word that echoed in my mind for the rest of the day. It was as if that nun, after decades buried in agony, had found a new opportunity to speak, and she was using the only channel available, the body and mind of the one who violated her grave. That is, me. But what disturbed me most wasn't what the priest said, but what he didn't have the courage to say. Because as I stood to leave, he grabbed my wrist, looked into my eyes with an almost desperate intensity and whispered, "Not all souls want to be freed, my son. Some just want company." That same night, the temperature dropped sharply. There was no cold front forecast, no sign of a storm, but a thick fog began to creep across the hills surrounding the convent, as if something from the past had returned to breathe through the trees. I lay for hours unable to sleep, my eyes fixed on the ceiling, feeling the weight of that revelation crush me from within. The idea that a soul could desire companionship rather than rest corroded my logic like rust on ancient iron. But there was something worse. What if that soul, forgotten, sealed, and suffocated for decades, was now awake, and hungry. At 2:48 a.m., the sound returned. But not from outside, not from the convent. It came from below, from the bedroom floor, as if something was slowly dragging itself beneath the floorboards. I sat up in bed, held my breath, and listened. A rhythmic, irregular but insistent sound. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a pipe. It was a fingernail, as if bony fingers were scratching the wood from within, drawing symbols I couldn't see but could already feel on my skin. The air grew heavier. The light wavered for a second, and in the mirror on the wall, something formed. It was just vapor, but it looked like a word written in haste. Aura, I touched. The glass with trembling fingers. It was gone. The next morning, I couldn't work. I excused myself from the convent's manager and walked to the side garden where the cloistered nuns' cloister used to be. Stone ruins, pieces of broken stained glass windows, a rusty cross lying on the ground. The place was abandoned, but there were fresh marks in the earth, as if someone had walked there the night before. Deep, bare footprints, someone shuffling their feet as if they could barely stand. I followed the footprints to the side of the old cloister well and noticed that the wooden lid sealing it had been dislodged, just a few inches, but enough to make the air smell like burnt candles, metal, and stale incense. I returned to the convent, distraught. I found the caretaker, Victor, and asked him to take me to the old archives. I wanted to find something about Sister Agnes. He was reluctant, but relented. We descended to a small, stuffy room in the convent's basement, with iron cabinets and numbered boxes. After more than an hour of searching, we found an unmarked folder bearing only the symbol of an inverted cross, not a satanic one, but the one symbolizing the martyrdom of Peter. Inside were handwritten notes in Latin, old photos of nuns with their faces scratched out, and a letter addressed to the local bishop, dated 1935. The contents froze me completely. In the letter, a sister described Agnes's final days in the convent. She said that Agnes had stopped speaking to the other nuns, that she spent hours in silence facing a wall, murmuring phrases in dead languages. She said she no longer slept, and that her eyes seemed to glow in the dark. Further on, she reported that one night, during a fit of rage, Agnes prophesied that in the future someone would open the earth before its time and be the first to hear the reverse prayer of the damned. The exact words were, "He will hear the voice, he will not be released, he will be released. He will hear, he will not be acquitted, he will be locked up." I swallowed hard. It hit me like a sentence, as if by digging up Loretta's grave I had unearthed something much older. And now that curse had found the body of a gravedigger as its vessel, a man already accustomed to death, who no longer questioned what lay between flesh and oblivion. And for that very reason, perhaps, more vulnerable to the call of the forgotten. That night before bed, I set my phone to record again. But this time, hidden under the bed. I didn't want to capture the outside environment. I wanted to hear the floor. What was captured there, however, surpassed anything I expected. The recording began with static, then the sounds of creaking wood, heavy breathing, and then a laugh, low, dry, feminine. And right after that, 3 loud thuds, as if something or someone was trying to get out of somewhere. And the worst part wasn't that, it was what came next. The sound of a key turning in a lock, but coming from within the earth. Returning to the cemetery that morning was like crossing an invisible border, a tenuous threshold between what was still my world and what was beginning to reject me. From the iron gate, something felt off. The sound of my footsteps no longer echoed as before, and even the wind blowing between the graves seemed to skirt my body as if avoiding me. I walked slowly, feeling a constant shiver down my spine, not caused by the cold, but by a strange sensation of being watched. Only this time, it wasn't like before. It wasn't as if someone was watching me. It was as if the ground itself was strange to me. I passed graves I had sealed months ago, and they all looked different. The inscriptions seemed faded, the grass taller, the cement cracked as if time had moved on without me. I reached Loretta's grave and knelt to brush away the dead leaves. Touching the wooden cross, I felt a shock. Not electric, but emotional. A memory that wasn't mine invaded my chest. A feeling of pain, of rejection, of abandonment. It was so strong that I lost my balance and fell backward, my heart racing as if someone had reached inside me and squeezed hard. As I stood up, something stopped me. My own name was scratched into the wood of the cross. Michael. The letters were fresh, as if they had been written that very morning. I looked around, searching for some explanation, but the cemetery was utterly silent. A thick silence, not of peace, but of waiting. It was as if the souls buried there had held their breath, waiting for the next movement. I walked to the ossuary, and there, among the records of old burials, I noticed that the ledger had been altered. My name appeared as the person responsible for a burial I never attended. Special burial, Sister A. I froze. I had never recorded that name. I had never dug that grave. But the handwriting was mine. The stroke, the date, even the signature. Everything was the same. As if someone, or something, had used my hand to record a ceremony my body couldn't remember performing. I began to doubt my own sanity. Time seemed to slip through my fingers, and the line between what I saw and what I felt began to blur. The voices, the whispers, the pounding on the ground, everything began to form a pattern. Returning to the main part of the cemetery, I saw that the gate I had entered through was now locked from the outside with chains. Chains that hadn't been there at dawn. And when I tried to call out, no voice returned. Only the sound of the chapel bell, which began to toll on its own, once, twice, 3 times, then stopped abruptly as if interrupted by invisible hands. I looked up at the top of the tower and saw, for a split second, a dark silhouette behind the stained glass windows, motionless, as if staring at me. Time inside seemed to fold in on itself. With every minute, the day grew darker, as if the sun were being covered by something other than a cloud. And then I understood. The cemetery no longer recognized me. As one of the living, something in me had changed. Maybe because of the engraving, maybe because of the name on the cross, or maybe because I myself had already been chosen to be part of that forgotten soil. And it was when I turned to leave that I realized something even more terrible. My own grave was already open, waiting for me. Back at the convent, I had no doubt that something ancient and deeply disturbing had been awakened. I decided to confront Father Clemente one last time. But when I reached the sacristy, he was gone. The door was ajar, the candlelight still flickering on the table, but he had disappeared. In his place was only a sealed envelope with my name written in jagged letters. I opened it with trembling hands, and there it was, the truth. A handwritten account by Clemente himself, confessing something he never dared say aloud. The buried nun was not Loretta. She never was. According to the confession, Loretta Chambers never existed. The name was invented to conceal the true ritual, a desperate attempt to permanently seal Agnes's soul, which had been disturbing the convent grounds for decades. The body buried in the cemetery was, in fact, what remained of Sister Agnes after her seclusion. The bones had been secretly stored by previous priests, fearing that burying them would cause an even greater spiritual rupture. But the visions intensified, and when Clemente took over the convent, he received the order, give her a tomb, a false name, a dignified end, and never speak of her again. But Agnes never accepted. Her soul sought not redemption but revenge. Revenge for being burned alive inside a stone cell while praying for forgiveness. Revenge for every prayer that went unheard. Revenge against the men who dared to decide, in God's name, who should be silenced. With every word of the document, I felt her presence approaching. Not physically, but within my consciousness. As if each sentence were a key turning in the lock of my judgment. At the end of the story, Clemente left a warning. If you're reading this, she already knows who you are, and she will no longer be satisfied with voices, symbols, or nightmares. She wants presence, she wants a body, and maybe she's already chosen yours. The last words trembled on the paper, and beside them was an old photograph. It showed a vacant-eyed nun, dressed in black, standing in the convent courtyard. Behind her, the reflection in a window showed someone's face watching. Someone with my exact likeness. Since that day, I've never been able to sleep properly. The lights in my house flicker without explanation. The walls crackle in Latin, and sometimes, when I wake in the middle of the night, I feel the presence of something standing at the foot of the bed. It doesn't move. It doesn't speak. It just breathes. For me. And if you've come this far and still feel like your home is silent, pay attention to whether this silence is really yours. Because sometimes what seems like stillness is just someone waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. If you felt the tension of this story and want to continue hearing the darkest stories ever told by gravediggers, priests, and professionals who deal with death, subscribe to the channel now. Here, with each new video, we open another drawer of what was buried, but never forgotten. And believe me, you won't want to hear these stories alone.